Well, welcome everybody. My name is Brendan O'Reilly, and I'm the president of the Press Club of Long Island. We are the local chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists, and our event this evening is covering war from the Homefront Perspective. Our moderator is one of our PCLI board members, journalist and broadcaster David North. He has experience as a reporter, a producer, and a host of news and public affairs programs. David, let me let you take it away and introduce our esteemed panel.
Thank you, Brendan, and welcome everyone. I want to thank all our panelists and attendees today and welcome you. The subject of tonight's discussion is war. The heart of our conversation is home. The tools of our trade change, but a too familiar pattern remains. A long simmering situation somewhere erupts, and we're at war. And in the case of Afghanistan, a war of 20 years before making news with our abrupt departure in August. Today, this evening, the US and our allies in Europe may be on the eve of war about 8 years after Russia took Crimea, a sovereign part of the post-Soviet Ukraine. Correspondents work diligently, often in dangerous situations, to keep us informed, to guide us at home with the best available version of the truth. And I have to thank you for that, Carl Bernstein. Our panelists have insights gained from their own experiences about what we at home can do to help correspondents report the truth and connect our local viewers, readers, and listeners with the reliable information necessary to support responsible policy decisions. I'd like to introduce our panel. Hofstra Dean Mark Lukasiewicz is the Dean of the Lawrence Herbert School of Communications at Hofstra University. Among his credentials prior to his engagement with Hofstra, the Senior Vice President of Specials for NBC News, responsible for planning and supervising coverage of national and international news events, including the death of 9/11 mastermind Osama bin Laden and presidential debates and elections of 2004 through 2016. Also, while with NBC, the National Broadcasting Company, Luke led the news group Transformation Project, a reimagining and redesign of workflow across NBC Universal's many news platforms. He was NBC News' first vice president of digital media. He and his colleagues earned numerous Emmys, 2 Peabody Awards, and the grand prize of the Robert Kennedy Journalism Awards. And please be looking at the bios of each of our panelists for some very interesting details and experience and why we're so pleased to have them with us tonight. Subrata Day is Executive Vice President at Vice News. Earlier in her career, Subrata was associated with ABC News, where she was Vice President, Multi-Platform News, that is leading a transformative role in television news, executing digital strategies across many platforms. She has supervised reporting originating from the Near East, the Far East, Southeast Asia, the Caribbean, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, and throughout the USA. We also see she's had extensive experience, high-profile responsibilities at MSNBC and as a senior producer at NBC Nightly News. Roy Gutman has seen a few things for more than a few years. Many on Long Island may know Roy as the European Bureau Chief at Newsday, and during his years there, that included the fall of the Soviet Union and the Persian Gulf War. It was a coverage of catastrophe in Europe, the war in the Balkans, that earned a Pulitzer Prize, including his reports about genocide, Bosnia-Herzegovina. Roy also served as Baghdad, Iraq Bureau Chief for McClatchy newspapers and as their Middle East Bureau Chief based in Turkey. He also reported from Crimea when Russia moved in 2014. And some breaking news. As of March 1st, Roy will lead the Baltimore Council of World Affairs, and Roy will describe the council's goals and mission. And Desiree Diorio, and she has unique insights about the lives of U.S. service veterans and their families. She's a reporter for WSHU and for the American Homefront Project, funded by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. By the way, she earned her degree in journalism from Long Island's Stony Brook University. And Kat Colvin, an attorney with extensive experience internationally and a profound personal experience with the topic. Kat is a member of the advisory board for the Marie Colvin Center for International Reporting at Stony Brook University. of Journalism. Before becoming an attorney, Kat worked as a program director for the Executive Council on Foreign Diplomats and directed a rural development program in Venezuela. Also served as a foreign legal consultant for a firm in Santiago, Chile. Long Island, Kat was corporate counsel for a subsidiary of Cablevision, now a senior vice president and general counsel for Pal Corporation, a global supplier of filtration and purification products. Kat may share some impressions about U.S. affairs, most notably about climate change, our long, complicated relationship with Chile and Venezuela, perhaps, but most notably and personally about her sister, Marie Colvin, who was killed while engaged by the UK's Sunday Times to report about the war in Syria. 10 years to the day on February 22nd, Marie was killed covering that war. Kat, let's begin there. Please introduce us to Marie, to the mission of the Colvin Center for International Reporting at Stony Brook.
I feel a little bit of an imposter here. Thanks so much, David, with such impressive journalism credentials. Marie, as you said, it's been 10 years since her death. We started the Marie Colvin Center for International Reporting, not only to remember her legacy, but also to teach the next generation of journalists in the hope that we never forget how important it is to report from the ground. Marie really believed that you couldn't truly cover a story, a war or any other story without actually being there to bear witness. I'm extremely impressed at the journalists who continue to go in today. I think if Marie saw what was going on in Syria, that the slaughter has continued for 10 years, she'd be horrified. But I think maybe even as disappointing is how difficult it's become to cover wars. So I know Roy has actually been there and can see it's really, I'm stealing words here, but it's really a war crime masquerading as a war. And for any journalist to go in there to report is risking their lives. I'm just so impressed that all of you who, continue to bring that news to our doorsteps.
Marie, just a personal note, working for Long Island radio station WALK, when Marie was killed, it was mentioned that she was a Long Island resident. She'd gone to high school here. I think there's a disconnect among a lot of our listeners about the war and overseas issues in general. But when they heard that she was from Long Island, town of Oyster Bay, we got calls from many women who wanted to know if she'd gone to high school in Oyster Bay, what was her year of graduation. And it was very clear that having a personal connection to someone who they might have known made the war more real and somehow more present for them. I'd like to ask you about your role with the center. How important it is to make a personal connection with international affairs and issues, if that seems insurmountable as Americans have short attention spans and are largely concerned about ourselves.
Yeah, I find the work with the center to be so inspiring. The students, many of them from middle class backgrounds, some haven't traveled. One of the programs that I particularly love there is called Journalism Without Walls, and it takes students to foreign countries. Many of them are getting a passport for the first time, and they report as stringers. They've gone to Russia, Ecuador, Turkey, Cuba, I can't even name, and they're actually filing stories from those places. Great learning experience for them with the professor there to guide them. I think that's just the best way to teach. We also host visiting professors who are practicing journalists and sponsor a lecture series. We've got one coming up this week, actually. So it's been a terrific experience. And we were very excited to have the school on Long Island because Marie, my family are Oyster Bay residents and Oyster Bay High School graduates. So it's meaningful to have it here on Long Island.
Just another personal question. Was she an adventurous girl? Did you have any idea that she would be driven to go around the world and put herself in personal danger like that?
No question. I grew up, Marie sort of took me over when I was a toddler, and she regaled me every night with stories of all different countries, dancing in the streets in Carnival and running with the bulls in Spain and throughout the whole world. home to me. So I never expected she'd stay in Oyster Bay, that's for sure. And she was always an amazing storyteller, artist, writer, brilliant. My idol, lifelong idol and hero. So I only wish that she had longer with us to really, I can't say master her craft because she did, but to share more with us. So Marie Marie was an adventure. Every time she blew into town was an adventure for the whole family.
We'll return for more stories and perhaps more insights that may inspire a younger generation of reporters who may want to, may feel that the world is just the right size. I was going to say Long Island may be too small, but the world may be a good thing. In that role, Roy Goodman, thank you so much for joining us. I was aware of you. I'm not a native Long Islander, but I knew of your byline and your reporting with Newsday. It is a pleasure to meet you virtually. And I'd like to ask you, I can frame this with another quote. I quoted Mr. Bernstein earlier. God created war so Americans would learn geography. And that was either Mark Twain, Ambrose Bierce, probably not George W. Bush. But your thoughts about that it seems to be tragic that there's little interest in the world until suddenly lives are at stake.
Well, that's true. We have a lot of good coverage and a need for good coverage at home. Because journalism starts at home. And you need to cover your local authorities, the municipality and the state you're in, and Washington, and it's a full-time reading job just trying to keep up with American news, and world news is sort of comes as an extra, and unless something bleeds, it doesn't lead. To use that terrible cliche. The idea that American newspapers and news organizations and radio and TV should be basing people full-time abroad is something that is not intuitive to most Americans, I think. And I think that a lot of our news organizations, by the way, have retreated from overseas, which is a terrible shame. But the fact is, we need to know what's going on in the world, because if we don't, we could be next. I mean, I think it was a Russian official who just said the other day that Americans are so concerned about Ukraine, but nobody probably knows where Ukraine is. So it obliges us. We are not just people living in the middle of nowhere. We happen to be Americans whose government and whose country and whose countrymen actually are dominant in the world. And the world order depends on us. The rule of law, everything else. And if it collapses, believe me, it hits us hard at home. I myself got the bug when I was in college. I went to a small Quaker college in Pennsylvania. And I just decided I was interested. It was during the Cold War period, and I decided that what was happening in Eastern Europe, the Soviet control, basically police state control of the small countries like the Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, was not getting any attention or very limited attention. But this is sort of a dramatic situation, because here we are in a world that the United States is supposedly leading and in a sense dominating. And these are the people on the other side. They're under police state. They're under communism. What is going on in there? What's on their minds? To talk about the people. I wound up after about 10 or 15 years in journalism at Newsday. And I didn't know how lucky I was, because Newsday took the attitude that its readers, it may still do it, but certainly in the old days, that its readers really mattered, and we had to somehow give them the story, the human story of what is going on in the world. Not the Washington diplomatic boring story of supposed diplomacy, but what's happening to real people. And this is what guided me when I was covering, I covered Eastern Europe for them. I covered the fall of the Berlin Wall because I was always looking for the human story. And in Bosnia, that is what led me to cover what I consider, and I think really was, a genocide. A mass killing of people just because of their ethnic background. And I got it by talking to refugees, by talking to people who had nothing left who left with maybe one bag and the clothes on their backs. But each had a story. And I started collecting stories, and I discovered that some of them had been held in concentration, the equivalent of concentration camps. There are many cases of rape. There have been the destruction of the culture. But I got it from average people. And then the Newsday formula was: it's not enough to just report this. You've got to then check it out. You go to the people who are supposed to be responsible, in this case, Slobodan Milosevic and the Serbs of Serbia, Bratovan and Karadzic and others, and you ask them for their comment. You ask them, this is what I've seen, what's your responsibility? And that combination of the human story plus going to the guys at the top on the other side made for a possibility of explaining to the readers in Long Island, the little picture, the human picture, and then the big picture as well. And I thought Newsday had a terrific attitude towards the news that I don't know if anybody else has ever quite equaled it. I met Marie in Bosnia. I loved her. I just admired her because she had pluck and this courage in everything she did. Nothing was going to stop her. And I found myself inspired by her, and we traded notes. We didn't really, journalists didn't work together that much there. Each of us would have our own team, a translator, a driver, and sometimes, in my case, I was very lucky to have a photographer. Because again, Newsday's attitude was, we've got to bring the story home to the public. And the only way you can do that is with good photography that backs up the story, that explains the story. I later covered, I got very interested in the laws of war. Why? Because I saw them violated all over the place in Bosnia and in the Balkans. And I actually helped draft a guide to what are the war crimes that we journalists should be watching out for. And this is one of the things that drove me to get interested in Syria. Because as Kat said earlier,
in the interest of time, forgive me for interrupting you, because each of these experiences shapes and colors lessons for all of us. But I think what's hanging over us tonight is that there may be a hot shooting war in Ukraine very soon. And looking at your bio, your history, I see you were also posted in Turkey. You have a picture of the global scope. That Russians they're controlling Crimea to the south of Ukraine. They're massed on the border to the east of Ukraine. They're in the nation of Belarus to the north, maybe from the distance of New York City to Patchogue within striking. With your observations in history, are we on the edge of a hot war?
Well, yes and no. I mean, we are, in the sense that the Russians, if Putin decides, could be in Ukraine tomorrow and could annex more territory and could be in a shooting war. It would be the dumbest thing, in modern times, because the Ukrainians will resist, and because he will manage to unite the entire West until the Western countries provide a lot of aid. So it would be long, bloody, a lot of body bags. It would upset world order completely. I don't see what the real gain is for Putin to do this. I do think Ukraine really matters. I spent a couple tours there, not more than maybe 6 weeks at the outside. And I found again, trying to cover the human story there, really fascinating. And I wish that more journalists were doing that today. You know, with my own reading, I find things are much too abstract for me to grasp sometimes. I want to know what the attitudes of average people are.
Roy, do you think that Newsday had an advantage, if you will, in that Long Island, metropolitan New York is the home to so many ethnic groups, that if they report on something going on in Eastern Europe, there's a chance that there's a large ethnic population who truly at heart care about what's going on. So it's sort of in our DNA to be a little more global than some other.
Well, I think, yeah, the attitude there was, we're all ethnic from somewhere, and we should pay attention. I mean, I have to tell you, I don't think there were any Bosnians in Long Island at the time I was writing from Bosnia. So, and you know, I was on a tear in the sense that I just did stories for month after month. But I think people got interested. They realized that, you know, there but for the grace of God go I. I could be there. I could be born there. And if you tell the human story, you know, you engage their interest. How many Afghans are there in Long Island? Well, there's quite a few now, probably, but I don't think during the time of 9/11 or before that there were very many. So but the whole attitude has to be: we need to tell the human story. We need to engage our readers or our viewers. We need to get you know, the news behind the news, the story behind the story. We have to tell. We have to find a narrative and put it before people. And this is not easy. I mean, you think of Syria, where when Marie was shot or rather killed, it was not an accident. The government was taking aim at her. And you see, and Marie is a person who does the human story, who did the human story. And they didn't want reporters in there at all. And they still don't want, Assad still doesn't want them in there. And that's the other thing. If they don't want us, that's where I want to be. You know, you've got to figure out who are the people who are trying to keep us out. And we've got to figure out a workaround in every case so that we can actually cover it and put the real news before the people.
Well, I want to explore that connection. I'd like to reintroduce Desiree Diorio. Desiree, as a young person, I see you also had some experience with the Long Island Press as an intern, a weekly newspaper on Long Island. It was my pleasure to speak with high school students around the island about careers in journalism. And I found as I moved from school district to school district, there was a vast difference in how they regarded news, especially about war and U.S. involvement. It seemed that there was like no connection. An older generation might have been worried about being drafted into a conflict, so might have educated themselves. But unless someone had an actual relative or they were thinking of going into the military, there was almost a shocking unawareness of what was going on in Iraq and Afghanistan. Was that the feeling among your classmates? Is that something you observed as you were in high school and college?
That's very interesting that you mentioned that. I just filed recently a story on how we were very close to requiring women to register for the draft. That was in the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act that just passed in December. There was a provision in there that got stripped out at the last minute, but we were the closest we ever were to requiring young people to register for the draft, to require women to register for the draft the same way men do. And I was on Stony Brook University's campus trying to find those men on the street interviews. What do you think about this? I had maybe 5 minutes of usable sound after spending all afternoon trying to talk to students about this. Nobody knew what I was talking about. Even after I explained it, they didn't even seem to have too much of an opinion on it one way or the other. So at least with that story, my experience tracks with exactly what you're talking about with the high school students. So the American Homefront Project is a collaboration of about half a dozen public radio newsrooms across the country. And we only focus on the issues that impact military service members, their families, and veterans. So this goes to what Roy Gutman was just talking about. But so the story for us isn't going to be, you know, the 10th Mountain Division out of Fort Drum is heading to Poland to help, you know, defend US allies against Russian aggression. The story would be for us, you know, Sergeant John Doe from the 10th Mountain Division out of Fort Drum just deployed, and now his wife is left behind to try and juggle trying to finish her degree and hold down her job and care for their 3 children. And the childcare options at Fort Drum are terrible. I don't know if that's true. I made up the last part, but that's the kind of humanity and the humans behind these stories that the American Homefront Project looks at.
We'll be exploring that with what time we have left. I'd like to put our educator on the spot for a moment. Dean Luke, you have a terrifically well-rounded background in journalism and media. I'm seeing that you were very close to guiding and directing Good Morning America for ABC, which was is a general interest program with lifestyle features and hard news segments. So you have to be cognizant of how to bring the hard news into the conversation for a wide general audience. And then I see you segued into digital platforms, and I have to imagine a lot of that is niche marketing, steering stories to appropriate demographics. How do you bridge that divide so that general audiences are all getting the same story, hearing that best available version of the truth, going back from history to tomorrow, to the future?
Well, in full disclosure, I have to say I was executive producer of Good Morning America for about 5 minutes before I was fired. But moving past that, I
those
certainly,
are the greatest learning experiences.
It was, but I survived. You know, things have changed and continue to change, and I know Subrata will have a lot to say about this, in how Americans consume their news, and particularly how they consume electronic news. And war reporting is getting, I think, a lot more challenging. You know, when I worked at World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. I worked periodically with Tom Brokaw and then Brian Williams at NBC Nightly News when I ran special events and during various conflicts and war coverage, Osama bin Laden, as you suggested. And when we were in the special broadcasting mode, when we were interrupting, you know, The Price is Right was no longer going to be on, or Law and Order was no longer going to be on because we're going to take the air and hold the air for a while, we had the chance to really talk to audiences and give them nuance. But that was the rare circumstance. Most war reporting, even today, watching Ukraine coverage on any of the nightly newscasts, it isn't necessarily the lead story. I was just watching ABC News Tonight. It was a tell, meaning there wasn't a reporter. It was just the anchor talking for about 22 seconds or 25 seconds over some pictures. It comes in short snippets. It's very hard to give the context. It is overwhelmingly tempting to report the home angle. And Des, while your publication is very much focused on that, right, you could argue that for a national audience, what we should be talking about is what Roy was talking about, the geopolitics, the importance of Ukraine to the NATO alliance, to the global order that America has fostered ever since the end of World War II. It's very hard to get that into 2 minutes. And where the two other things I would say about this is where the most engaged American news audiences are now getting their news on screen is cable news. And I say news in quotes because those are really in prime time now, completely opinion channels. And I'm certainly not talking about Subrata's organization, but I am talking about MSNBC, CNN, Fox, where it is through an opinion lens. And so stories that don't fit the narrative of either side tend not to get covered with quite the prominence that they would elsewhere. And let me just make one other random observation that, and again, I'm deferring to Subrata, who has a lot more experience in the field covering conflict. But one of the things I've noticed, and I've been actually talking to some of my students about, as we watch the Ukraine conflict, the narrative that we are seeing every day, right, is Russian saber rattling, Russian buildup, Russian might. I believe almost every image we're seeing of warplanes, ships, tanks, and rocket launchers is footage shot and provided by the Russian military. We don't have access. So again, are we disclosing that to the audience? Does it matter? It seems to me the Russian military is not simply giving us raw footage of whatever's happening. They're picking images that make the military buildup look big, powerful, scary, effective, organized, dominant, all the rest of it. And American audiences night after night after night are getting those images with not a whole lot of disclosure that these are propaganda images. That is one of the big challenges of our business that I will say, you know, we have at NBC, we built a memorial right next to our newsroom for I believe it was 17 different NBC News personnel who've been killed in conflict since the company has been in operation, whether it was David Bloom in Iraq or the Guyana massacre in Jonestown, the ambushes in Central America and in Vietnam. One of the things that I think people sometimes fail to appreciate when they talk about the superficiality of television news is television reporters have to get to where it's happening. They don't have the luxury of, and full props and homage to Marie, who was always in the middle of what she was covering. But I'm sure Marie knew some of the reporters we all knew who wrote their stories from the hotel bar because they didn't need to be out there. Television reporters and television camera people have to get to where the worst of it is happening. And it's a very, very risky enterprise.
Mark, you've raised a point. I'd like to talk to Subrata about this as well. That it's all kind of circular here. Roy was talking about Newsday's dedication to making sure that the foreign story came home, and you're addressing where information comes from and may be provided by Russian propaganda outlets. It seems that a lot of foreign correspondence now is outsourced, that there are local people on the ground who we don't know, and perhaps they have agendas depending on their political affiliations or ethnic affiliations. Subrata, please tell me your opinions about that, about the branding connection of a reporter in the field compared to someone who's local as a contractor. Is that a factor in getting U.S. audiences to connect and care about those stories?
I suppose I have a different perspective on how U.S. audiences connect to stories, because I found that, you know, this next generation, I mean, that's the news we do. It's for this next generation of news consumers. They want these stories. We, you know, at Vice News, we pretty much only do conflict reporting, whether it's here in the U.S. or if it's I mean, right now I have, you know, teams in Syria, in every conflict zone, not conflict as we traditionally look at it, but really, you know, we are in an age of an authoritarian regime. And so conflict is actually quite mundane in the day-to-day in terms of suppressing people's movements and what they do. It's a slow burn. And we found that, you know, everybody's engaged in that content because we're telling very human stories. And an interesting thing has transpired in this pandemic is, you know, we've dealt with globalization in, you know, in the economy and in many ways, but truly what's happened is experientially, people have been stuck, but yet experiencing the world through content in a truly global way. So I have found, look, we were the #1 trending story on YouTube on the day, you know, the day that I would say Afghanistan really punched through in August. That is never happens. It's a Kardashian video or it's something else, but there we sat and it was just reporting, and partners in that reporting were our local journalists. You know, I think actually, I just believe that it's about the investment of time you make in that story. And people, when they decide to connect, wanted to connect to something real. So it isn't really about you going in when something feels like it's bubbling up, but it's the fact that you've been there all along. And that I think people have responded to. So, and very key to that is people who are present for the story, but also the people we work with locally. There's a real movement going on in storytelling and journalism from people in countries that feel like they're getting covered and want to have, they want to be an agent in their own story. So I actually think that's a benefit. It just gives texture to the storytelling. I think it lends some authenticity. You have to be very real about these things. And I do think viewers will respond. And you're talking to somebody who spent most of my career network news. And I believe we did it there as well. We would devote the time and resources, and our audiences responded. I'm not cynical about our country and what people care about. I really do believe that they want to make human connections. You just have to deliver on that connection in a really meaningful way.
That's a big topic in journalism circles, especially with the press club, is news literacy. Do you have an opinion or comments about news literacy and maybe a healthy skepticism about foreign reporting for news consumers? What should we be looking at? Mark indicated that sometimes the action footage from Ukraine looks very militaristic and impressive, and what ends up on our screens. What should we as consumers be looking for as far as vetting those reporters who we don't know, who don't have a hand on them, for example? How can we be sure we're not being manipulated?
Right. Well, I think, it's important to look for somebody who, to really follow people who have spent a long time in the region, in the area, and who aren't there just at the moment that something feels like it has erupted. So I guess it's like, it's the longer take rather than the quick take. And a lot of it is, I think when you're looking for content that's meaningful, are people allowing people on the ground to speak? Are they telling you a narrative that feels like if I flip through the channels, I'm going to get the same narrative somewhere else? Or are they driving the 10 hours to the border to actually see what's going on? If you can take a reporting journey with this reporter, I think that tells you that you can attach yourself to some real information. And I think that's true in this country too. I think that if you can actually take a journey with somebody and they're going to come back to that story and they're going to allow you to hear from the people that they're talking to in a real way, as opposed to just the sound of their own voice, then I think that's where you want to spend some time.
I think if I can say, David, I think Subrata said two things that I find really interesting and that resonate with what I hear here. Number one is that I think my generation looks at foreign reporting through the lens of sort of the tectonic plates of empire and who's up and who's down, and the West impinging on the East, and the the developing world versus the old industrial economies, and who's up and who's down. And I think the newer generation, the students who I see every day, their global perspective has to do with, we're on a planet that we all share that is in peril. And I'm interested in what my peers everywhere in the world are thinking and doing and saying. And so those human stories connect on a layer that's different than this sort of Washington-based, London-based geopolitics stuff. And the other thing I think that is interesting that I hear from young journalists now is some skepticism and suspicion of the foreign correspondent model that, again, my generation grew up with, that a lot of us aspired to be, right? Which is that correspondent who travels all over the world, parachutes into the hot spot. We even use that term in television news. Parachute in, get the lay of the land, tell the story and digest it, and then bam, we're off to somewhere else. There are a lot of young journalists who say that's a bad model. That's a model that isn't fair to the people whose story we're telling. And that, as Subrata said, you've got to find people who actually have been living in the story, know the story, get deep into it. Not the trench coat journalist who's hopping off and on planes all the time.
I have two more questions. I see we're running low on time. Of those stories on the home front, as I'm remembering too that there was a time of that glamorous foreign correspondent, and perhaps it's like historic that there's jingoism and glory of battle and going to war, and people drum up support. But you see the collateral damage, and of course we have differences of influxes of drugs and refugees and social problems that come in the wake of war. Describe the Homefront project and the efforts to address mental health issues, because that is so important for every aspect of our community. Families of our service men and women are encountering every day.
Yeah, and I think going to Mark's point, I think that might also be another way to get into making the public care about the actions that the military is taking in our name in other countries, because the soldiers who come back from those conflicts are not well. It really, I've only been on this beat for about a year. It is a tragedy, the way our veterans and our active duty are treated when they return from the things we send them out to do. And I'm not talking about the Vietnam War era style of ostracizing soldiers. I'm talking about guys who come back with PTSD who literally can't process these emotions, and they just need some help. Yeah, I mean, every superlative adjective of every negative thing you can think of, it's a real tragedy that we can't treat these guys better when they get home. And that's not even just mental health. A huge issue right now among the veteran population is the diseases that they're dealing with burn pits, which were used throughout Afghanistan and Iraq for however long we've been there. You know, DOD made a big show several months ago about how they're going to, you know, overhaul mental health services for veterans. I'm not seeing too much reality of that on the ground at this point. Are things going to get better now that the war in Afghanistan is theoretically over? I don't know. I doubt it. But that remains to be seen. But yeah, that's a huge issue. And I think we can use, use is not a good word. I think we can leverage the issues that soldiers are dealing with to make the public care about what goes on abroad.
We'll be taking questions for our panelists in a moment, but I'd like to return to Kat Colvin. Kat, what do you think is Marie's legacy, especially for young people, about the world of being a correspondent? And ultimately, what would you regard as a success in your mission at the Institute?
Well, you know, I really, Subrata, a lot of what you said reminded me so much of how Marie reported that optimism and idealism and belief in people and the connection and what Mark was saying about all of us being citizens of the world. And that's just much more meaningful, I think, to a younger generation. So I love hearing that, and the passion that, you know, Des brings to the work that she's doing. So I hope that her, I think Marie was very humble. She didn't seem it, but she was very self-deprecating and humble. So I hope that she inspires journalists to keep that passion and that faith. And I don't think it's a profession that anyone would actually choose. I think it chooses you. And I just keep hoping that that's the case. The other, the
And what
other
would be
thing
the
that
central
I
mission
just, I
be?
wanted to, yeah, just wanted to mention something else, that what really motivated Marie was people, and in particular, people who are suffering, and the victims of war. So, I appreciate so much how much I've heard from various panelists tonight on that. That is a motivating factor to me, in work that I do with a foundation I set up in Marie's name to support victims of war. The millions and millions of refugees, freezing to death in Turkey just the other day, and the injuries to children in the camps is just horrific. So I appreciate so much hearing from the younger journalists tonight. Gives me faith.
All use always. And I want to thank our panelists. And now let's take questions from our attendees.
I have one, David. I'm curious what the panelists think about how the media has covered the impact of these wars on the home front, and well, basically that's the question: is what kind of job has the media done about covering the impact of these wars on the home front, or getting people involved in paying attention to these issues? I'm more interested in that than actually in covering the wars, themselves.
Anyone please feel confident about addressing that?
I was going to defer to Des, but I mean, I certainly can say that I think that, after decades involvement in Afghanistan, and also just a continued and, lengthy involvement in Iraq, I'm disappointed that that reporting about, as Des mentioned, about PTSD and just sort of the long-term impact on people who serve and also their families isn't just sort of woven into the fabric of really every kind of experiential thing we talk about. It's very, it's very much a part of, a whole generation, more than a generation of people in this country. And it does feel, I mean, it's a very painful period. And I know people want to move on, but it's not over. And so I think in terms of covering conflict, PTSD is a part of that narrative. And it feels like people always want to end conflict, right? And that's the kinetic part of it, whatever it is, but there isn't an end. And I think it's the job of certainly journalists to really remind people that this is a continued part of conflict. It's far from over. Yeah.
My question is not so much covering the soldiers coming home. It's the people who never fought. It's the home front. What kind of coverage has the media done of regular Americans during these wars? I mean, how it impacts them, why they should be interested.
Let me offer a comment on that
Roy,
myself, which is I had the experience during the Bosnia War that it really, the coverage, and it was truly not me alone, it was people like Marie and a lot of other reporters, that it made a difference. It made a difference for the public in terms of the receptivity to take in refugees, for one thing, and to resettle them. And a huge number of Bosnians came to the United States, hundreds and hundreds of thousands. Whereas by contrast, in the Syria war, where we were kept out and where people were killed, where reporters were killed and kidnapped and handed over to ISIS and whatever else, and we had to stop covering on the ground in the country, the interest diminished hugely in the United States. And last year, the number of Syrian refugees, and this is a country now where there's 12 million people of the 24 are now not in their homes. And 6 million are refugees abroad. This is an incredibly terrible catastrophic humanitarian situation. And the United States took in like 43, I think it was last year. And so the whole interest in, if we journalists don't generate an interest in what's going on there, the American public will never relate to the real people and their fate.
Thanks, Roy.
Unfortunately, the connection seems to be if there's a war in the Middle East and the price of gas goes up, then people pay attention. we want to be idealistic as journalists. How do we keep our classic American ideals alive through conflicts and bring that home?
Yeah. David, the point about when people choose to pay attention is something that keeps coming to my mind as I listen to us go through this presentation tonight. There seems to have been like months at a time during the Iraq War or the Afghanistan War where it just was never the lead story on the news, even though these wars were ongoing. American servicemen and women were in fact dying, but it just stopped making the headlines for a while. I know one criticism is that once we entered Iraq, the coverage and the focus of both the media and our military went away from Afghanistan. And then because we had lost focus on Afghanistan, we had the situation where we spent 20 years there and then we pulled out and the Taliban came right back like the last 20 years never happened. And I guess my question is, does the media have culpability for, banging the drums to enter these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and then stepping back and, letting things fester in these other countries, but not giving them the attention that I think that they deserved?
Roy, I think you're equipped to address that one.
I can offer a comment on that if you can hear me. I'm not sure if well, I don't think the media was banging on the drums in the war in Afghanistan. I mean, on the contrary, the media was covering it, but that's a case of an executive decision made at the very top to intervene in response to an attack on American lives and American property and American, huge number of Americans were killed. And the problem was that the government was really playing to public opinion. It's like what Putin may be doing right now in the case of Ukraine. It was going after, as Bush would say it, the bad guys, the varmints, kill the varmints. It was like revenge, rather than looking at the country from which the attacks came and Bin Laden and the Taliban, and seeing this as a real place with real people that was screwed up beyond belief, in large part because they were at war for a very long period of time, since 1970, in fact. Or rather 1980, when the Russians invaded and when the US helped push them out. In other words, there's a history, and you can't simply arrive there and send in forces to do one thing, kill the varmints, and ignore the place that you are working. And so what happened was the Americans would go after Bin Laden's people. They would drop bombs. They would do everything from great altitudes. They would kill a lot of local civilians. And they were ignoring the Taliban for the longest time. And the Taliban were, provided the context in which Bin Laden was able to set up his headquarters. So there was no analysis. There was no analysis by our leadership. And I don't know that journalists, most of them could have spotted this, because you have to know the history in order to spot it. I wrote a book about this because I was myself mystified as to why Afghanistan was going so wrong. But the fact is, our leaders have not only got, if they have to go to war, and this can happen, they've got to go into war with purpose, with political aims, with an outcome in mind, a stated outcome. We, the journalists, this is where we really do come in. We should hold them to account, that they actually deliver what they say they're going to do. But in Bush's case, he got away with not only going to war in Afghanistan without real long-term purpose, but he then left after 3 years and invaded, or 2 years, and invaded Iraq. And so we had 2 wars going on at the same time. I think it was a bit too much for the media, and the media could only sort of cover the flash and dash of each war. So I don't think we can blame the media there. I think we have to blame our leadership. But what we in the media should be doing is holding the leadership to account, that if they go to war, it's the last thing you've got, where you use all your power, you've got to get it right. You've got to have goals. You have to have political purpose. You can't just send men into and women into the jaws of disaster, because they will come back with PTSD, especially if they never figured out what the purpose was of the war that they're in.
And Roy, while we're talking about media holding the government and our policymakers to account, we are about out of time. And just a rhetorical question: can we, news consumers and journalists, hold media management accountable for chasing stories that have high clicks or attract a demographic that's profitable? And how do we manage to make these meaningful stories profitable, interesting, and rewarding for our communities? I want to thank you all for participating in this program. And just a reminder, the Press Club of Long Island has a number of programs similar, and upcoming events. We'd like to invite you to please check out pcli.org for, well, number one, the bios of our participants. This is a terrific panel, as you've witnessed, and upcoming events. Brendan, back to you.
Great, David. And I will reiterate, please visit pcli.org. We are hosting the Society of Professional Journalists Region 1 conference. It was originally supposed to be at Hofstra University, but unfortunately, because of COVID, we made the decision to move it online. That's happening on Saturday, March 19th, and it's going to be absolutely free. So please visit pcli.org for more details to register. And then we're planning another program for April that you'll be able to see the details on our website soon, which is going to be all about using photographs and videos without violating anyone else's copyright, and also what to do when your copyright has been violated. Please join us. And if you're interested in becoming a member of the Society of Professional Journalists, please visit spj.org. And when you have the opportunity to select your chapter, just select Press Club of Long Island. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. Thank you, panel. Thank you, David, for moderating. Have a great night.